Hey, so for this screencast, you are going to need something from that study guide again. So if you recall, if you click on Notes and Study Guide, you can get to that study guide. Here is that study guide document. And the page in question that we're going to want to use is this one right here. Again, if you don't have printing capability, don't panic. This is very easily drawn, and so you can just kind of draw this out, make it large to fit up the whole page, and then we'll talk about it, and we'll use it to talk about it. Because today is a very interesting topic. We are going to use our knowledge now of how action potentials and synapses work to understand how drugs affect the brain. So I'm going to skip this boring thing and go right into it. So I'm actually going to spend some time drawing on this diagram, and you have two pictures. We're going to start typical, and then we're going to see how cocaine affects the brain. So let's switch over.
Okay, so we have two copies of this, right? One and two. And so on this top one, I'm going to write typical. So this is what's normally supposed to happen with the synapse. And this is just a review of what we've already gone through. So basically, we start out and we have these synaptic vesicles. And their job is to store neurotransmitter. Like that. So in this example, the neurotransmitter is going to be a very specific neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, maybe you've heard of dopamine before, but dopamine is a neurotransmitter and it's associated with feelings of pleasure and joy. Okay, so to complete our diagram here, let me go ahead and add some receptor proteins. And I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. So these are our receptors at the other end of that synapse, that space. And there's nothing magical about 4. It just fits well in the picture. And then finally, I'm going to add little proteins that look like this on the other side here. And these are our reuptake channels. And you may remember that those get rid of the neurotransmitter after we're done. So this is the reuptake channels. And so here's how it works. In your brain, if an action potential comes down this neuron, I'll just kind of go, if this is an action potential, and we're doing the wave, that's messy, sorry. We're doing the wave and these action potentials are firing and they reach the end of the neuron. That causes these synaptic vesicles to move to the end of the cell, and then they release dopamine into the synapse. That dopamine then binds to the receptor protein, which then initiates another action potential. And in the case of dopamine, that sends a signal, that causes a signal in your brain associated with feelings of happiness or pleasure or joy. So a little happy face there. And then importantly, we have to get rid of that dopamine from the synapse. It sent its message, it's done. So now it goes away. That dopamine then moves back through the reuptake channel, and that is it. So, if someone walks up to you and is like, that's a nice outfit you're wearing. And you get that little, oh, thank you. That's that little dopamine tickle, That's just this little feeling of pleasure and joy, like, oh, why, thank you. Or if someone's like, hey, you did a good job on your test today. And you're like, oh, thank you so much. That's so nice. Then again, this is what's happening. There's this little message sent to your brain that's associated with dopamine. And these little moments of joy are associated with this neurotransmitter dopamine. So that's the normal situation. Now, let's introduce cocaine to the mix. So on this bottom picture, we're going to write cocaine. And we're going to just quickly set up the exact same situation. We've got our synaptic, wrong color. We've got our synaptic vesicles with dopamine in there. We've got our receptor proteins. I'll do the same number. We've got our reuptake channels. So far, absolutely nothing is different about this situation. But now I'm going to introduce a new character, a black rectangle, which I will call cocaine. Now, what cocaine does in the body is it blocks the reuptake channels for dopamine. And so if cocaine is in the system, it's just going to kind of cover up these reuptake channels and block them. And so now, watch what happens. Once again, just like normal, our action potentials fire. That causes the dopamine to be released into the synapse. That dopamine is going to bind to the receptor, and that's going to send this little signal of joy. Ah, I feel nice. But now, when that neurotransmitter goes to be removed from the synapse, it can't. It bounces off that cocaine, which has blocked the reuptake channel. And now that dopamine stays in the synapse, which means it's available to hit the receptor again, causing a little bit more joy. And then it, can't get out, hits the receptor again, causing a little more joy. And then hits it again, causing a little more joy. So instead of just this nice little dopamine tickle, like, oh, thank you for the nice comment, we have this like huge overabundance of dopamine, and that creates this huge absolute happiness, and that is what we call a high. That is where that euphoria comes from. Now you may be thinking to yourself, why is that a bad thing, Mr. Sanger? And so I have to be careful here because, we're on video. But, we think, don't we do things that make us happy? Chocolate makes me feel happy, so I have chocolate. So why is cocaine always kind of bashed? Why do people say it's such a bad thing? It's just making us feel happy, right? Well, here's the problem with cocaine. I mean, you know this. Cocaine becomes addictive. And the reason why is because your body is very good at maintaining what we call homeostasis. That means near constant body conditions. So what happens is your body recognizes, hey, I'm getting too much dopamine signaling over here. Something is out of whack. And so what it does in response is says, I know, since I'm getting too much signal of happiness over here, I'm just going to eliminate some of these receptors. And it breaks some of those down. So now you have fewer dopamine receptors in your body. So when your friend comes up to you and says, oh, what a nice outfit you have, all of a sudden you don't have as many of these receptors and you don't get that same dopamine tickle. And you just feel kind of, instead of this nice little, oh, thank you, you have this just kind of this bleh feeling. So then you're like, I feel kind of crummy. I know. Last time I did cocaine, I felt great. I'll do a little bit more. So you do more cocaine, woo, you get the high, you feel great for a little while, but then it wears off and your body is saying, too many receptors still. And now your friend comes up and is like, hey, good job on your test yesterday. And again, you don't feel good anymore. You're like, bleh, because you don't have enough receptors to send that dopamine signal. And so you take more cocaine, woo, and then your body eliminates those receptors. And you can see you get trapped in this cycle where you just can't feel quite as good as you once did without the presence of the drug in your system. And that is where addiction comes in. And with drugs like cocaine and heroin is a particularly bad one, they become extraordinarily addictive to the point where all of a sudden your life becomes this quest for the next hit of drug. And so, you can't maintain a job, you can't maintain relationships, and everything just starts to fall apart. And that is why these drugs are so bad. So don't do cocaine, kids.
So basically, to summarize, cocaine blocks the reuptake channels for dopamine. And by keeping dopamine in the synapse too long, it causes an overstimulation of that next cell, and that is what causes the high. The body's response is to break down receptor proteins, and now you can't quite get that same sense of feel good without that cocaine, and that's the basis for addiction. So don't do cocaine, children. Not a good idea. Let's talk about some other ones. Alcohol is a drug that also affects the brain. Now, alcohol is legal for those over 21 at least. And, if I said which drug is more harmful, many would probably say, oh, cocaine is more harmful. And on an individual level, that's probably true. But if you think about on a societal level, I would argue that alcohol is probably more harmful. Not a weekend goes by that police officers are in every major city across the country aren't called out to scenes of domestic violence, of sexual assault, of fighting, of car crashes, things like that, and quite often alcohol is a factor in these types of things. So even though it's legal, that doesn't mean it doesn't create problems. Um, what alcohol does is it can mimic, and again, this is just the effect on the brain, but it mimics the effect of an inhibitory neurotransmitter called GABA. So GABA's job is to kind of slow things down, it's like tone it down. And so if you think about the effects that alcohol has on the body, um, this kind of makes sense. So alcohol affects many parts of the brain. So one of the things you hear about somebody under the influence of alcohol is that they kind of stagger in their movements. Well, alcohol affects the motor cortex, and so that affects your physical movement. It affects your speech pattern because that's motor cortex. It affects how you walk and that sort of thing. You may have heard that it creates blurry vision. Well, that's because this alcohol mimics GABA, and that inhibits and slows down processes in the occipital lobe that processes vision. Um, you might have heard that alcohol causes people to do things that they might not otherwise do, and that's because alcohol inhibits the frontal lobe. And so you may think, wow, I really shouldn't insert dumb idea right now. But because alcohol is mimicking this inhibitory neurotransmitter, it inhibits those inhibitions, so to speak. By inhibiting your inhibitions, it causes you to do things that you wouldn't normally do, and therefore causes problems. It inhibits areas associated with memory and understanding and language and all sorts of things. So basically, alcohol affects many parts of the brain, and by slowing them down, causes issues. Um, I want to talk about one more category of drugs, and that's antidepressants. And I want to talk about these because they're legal, right? And in fact, they're medically prescribed by doctors. And chances are good that a significant number of students in the classroom are taking antidepressants. They're very common. Um, and so, what's going on with these? Well, there's different categories. So the first category is selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. Their job is or the way they work is that they block the reuptake of serotonin. So examples of these that people that may be taking, or you yourself: Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Lexapro, and Celexa are all SSRIs. And the mechanism of how they work should be very familiar. What they do is they simply block the reuptake of serotonin. Here it is. Um, and by blocking the reuptake of serotonin, it keeps the serotonin in the synapse longer, and then that overstimulates this next cell. Now you may think, wait a minute, that actually sounds a lot like the effect of cocaine. Is this like taking cocaine? No, it is not like taking cocaine. There's a couple differences. Number one, it is nowhere near as powerful as cocaine, so it doesn't create that high. Number two, these are taken for someone who has a chemical imbalance. So if someone is depressed, that means oftentimes that there's an imbalance in the neurotransmitter levels in their brain. And so by blocking the reuptake channels for serotonin, you are correcting that imbalance of neurotransmitters and sort of restoring the natural order of things. So it really is very, very biochemically and molecularly based. So just like a diabetic would take insulin to correct an imbalance, someone who is experiencing depression would take an SSRI to correct the imbalance. So another category of antidepressants are monoamine oxidase inhibitors, or MAOIs. These inhibit an enzyme that breaks down particular neurotransmitters: epinephrine, dopamine, and serotonin in the synapse. So example, these are Nardil, Parnate, and Emsym. And you may recall that in addition to reuptake channels for getting rid of the neurotransmitters. Sometimes there's an enzyme that can just break down those neurotransmitters. So an MAOI inhibits that enzyme so that, again, these neurotransmitters don't break down, stay in the synapse longer, and can overstimulate the next cell. So again, both of these types of categories of antidepressants are there to keep the neurotransmitters at a higher level than they normally are, which hopefully helps offset that depression. If you're interested in this topic, this link right here I think is worth checking out. It looks at all sorts of other drugs and how they affect the brain, and I think it's worth taking a look at.
So, a common question that I'm asked at this point is, so what happens when you recover from cocaine and you stop using it? Do those receptors come back? And I'll be quite honest, I am not entirely sure what happens at the biochemical level here if those receptors come back. Here's what I do know. They have done some studies that do show that the brain is permanently changed after this. And so I'll give you one example. They did an experiment where they took a group of people who had recovered from drug abuse and then a group of people who had never taken drugs really, and they showed both of them videos of other people doing drugs. And in the group who had never taken drugs before in their life, nothing really much happened interesting in their brains. They just watched the video and was like, that was that. But in the group who had recovered from drug abuse, their amygdalas lit up with activity. And the amygdala is kind of the thrill seeking part of the brain. And so, what this is showing is even though they've sort of recovered from the drug abuse, part of their brain is still craving that drug and is looking for it. And so, my understanding is that once you've recovered from drug abuse, it's never quite over. It's something you have to manage and deal with for the rest of your life, and it gets better and better as time goes on. But that little temptation kind of is always there in some form or another. Um, so, I guess my recommendation would just be skip that whole thing and just don't mess around with it.